All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Cassidy Westron. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the List Visual Arts Center, which is MIT's Contemporary Art Museum. Tonight, we are joined by the lovely Soala Ajienka here for a graduate student talk, which is a series that we have here at the List Center where we invite graduate students to expand on our exhibitions using their expertise in a similar subject matter as a way to really see how art and research are overlapping on MIT's campus. So as I said before, tonight we'll be hearing from Soala Ajienka, expand on the Carlos Reyes 18 exhibition. She's a Master of Architecture candidate at MIT, whose research is focused on material as a means to unpack narratives relating to energy, power, and its relationships. This multiplicity of contexts necessitates a sensitivity towards lived experience and the stratified nature of collective historical memory. She will discuss sleight of human touch, a design method predicated on imbuing artifact creation, and the design process with the human hand. This method of working will then be discussed in relation to Carlos Reyes' works, which leaves the resulting forms with the residues of time and the embodied energies of breath and touch exerted on an object. Through the lens of specific pieces of work from tapestry to painting and electronics, Ajienka will explore her approach to this design method. At the end, we will have a Q&A where you'll have a chance to ask any questions, so be thinking about that when you're hearing her talk. And again, thank you so much for being here and showing interest in our programming. So let's hear from Soala now.
Thanks, Cassie. You're incredibly kind. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really looking forward to speaking about my work, especially in conversation with the work of Carlos Reyes. And I remember getting the email from Cassie last year, actually the summer, and just thinking that probably it was the wrong email. But then when we had a conversation and when I sat with the work and looked more closely at it, I realized that there was a lot of synergy between the ideas that Carlos was trying to explore in his work and matters of concern that I had carried through with me before coming to MIT, but also that I had explored at MIT, excuse me, with the different projects that I had done, and concern relating to energy, latent energy, embodied energy, relating to materials, relating to memory, but also I think more surprisingly and quite peculiarly actually relating to electricity. And I'm gonna start with a very short story, and it's a story that's not, peculiar to me, but I think that anybody who has, experience living in, a precarious sort of energy environment would definitely relate to. So the first time I walked into this gallery, I saw Promisa, and I'd seen pictures of it online, but seeing it in person, right, it's a completely different experience. And the way I describe it in my mind, it's like it's a one-iric representation of the, precarious energy landscape in Puerto Rico. And for me, then it was a light bulb moment, right? And I'm using light bulb as a tongue-in-cheek, ironic statement, but it was a light bulb moment because it brought back memories of being back home in southern Nigeria. And southern Nigeria is a part of the world that is rich in energy as a resource, but deficient in energy as a service. And so very much what this work is trying to address. And it brought back memories of moments where there will be a power outage. And that comes with a deprivation of the senses, right? You have to kind of handle things and kind of figure out what to do next. And the thing that happens usually is that your hands reach out to feel the world around you and to kind of give you your bearing. And so that method then of trying to situate yourself in the world by feeling through similar forms, for me, was how I then existed within the space, but also emerging in the world. That was how I kind of formed my architecture and artistic practice through feeling, through touch. But I think also it's like there's a thing there where there's a long tradition also of kind of us as a people making the world around us through touch. And almost our fingertips, you see these things of our fingertips being so sensitive that when you're confronted with an object, that you're familiar with, its physical form, within 5 seconds, you're able to kind of recognize what it is. And we take it for granted, right? We focus on, say, sound, for example, or hearing, but our sense of touch is definitely crucial to our survivability and how, we've been here this long. And the way we then make objects is with that particular approach because objects then become stores of value, right? They become stores of memory, and they become expressions of particular things that we hold dear. And I'd say though, like going back to the story of, the memories that came when I saw this piece, is I can almost like recollect every single object in my parents' home because there have been those moments of touching and feeling them. And also, not just their form, but the little idiosyncrasies, right? Like the little marks on them. And the piece behind me by Carlos Reyes, West Side Club, is very much to that point of little marks and I guess little vandalisms is how they've been described, but names and places recorded and almost, placed in perpetuity. And what I find interesting about them too, it's not just about the forms and, the names and the letters, but there's something about figuring out the process through which they were made. Like you can see some of them that you can get a sense of the ones that were made in haste or the ones that were made in laxity. And I think that's like a very important thing where you see marks. They're not just marks in themselves, but there's a process behind them, right? And there's the hand as the thing that made the mark and the process of the hand in that. And that then brings me to the subject of my sort of talk. And in thinking about my work in relation to the work of Carlos Reyes, I think the hand is very much the thing that is present. And sleight of human touch is equally like a tongue-in-cheek statement because it borrows from like sleight of hand, as you know. But then sleight of hand as this thing that suggests cunning and suggests it doesn't have like the most positive connotations, but in parallel to that, there is the connotation of artful handling and artful manual dexterity. And for me, that's kind of what I'm latching onto, right? The ability to be artful in the process of handling things. And when I say sleight of touch, it's not, sleight of human touch more specifically, it's not just the hand, but I think the entire body and the entire sort of almost like the whole holistic way that our bodies exist in space, right? Not just touch, but also breath, but also pressure, but also moisture, right? How we exist, give to the world, and also take back from it. And then that kind of led me to sort of thinking about what to include and which one of my pieces to speak about in relation to the work of Carlos Reyes. And back to the conversation earlier about memory, I've done a lot of work in textiles, and textiles, they are kind of very easy to decipher the hand in them, right? You see a piece of tapestry, for example, you can start to understand the process of like the hand movements, the materials, the method of making, and also like as soft forms in contrast to the fragility and almost like hardness also of the work of Carlos Reyes. I think I eventually sort of decided not to include textiles because I think there was something about, it's like when you see it, you almost get it, right? But I wanted something that was very much focused on the process as opposed to the final product. And for me, then this piece, Troll, that I have printed out is what I'm choosing to add to this conversation, but also to speak about when it comes to the process of the hand in the sort of process and the whole, I guess, like pedagogy of making, where with this piece, it was something that I worked on my first semester at MIT, actually. And with the work Troll, so Troll for me was an essay on copper and its tectonic possibilities, kind of looking at the extent to which a material can be transformed from one form to another, but transformed with the hand. I think for me, it was important that I left the digital space because the digital was kind of a way to understand the form, right? I knew what I wanted to, the form that I wanted to make, but I didn't want that to be the extent through which I figured out the entire thing. I wanted my hand to be the way that I sort of molded, worked with the material. And so there was a lot of transformation that happened where copper wire became copper coil, became copper mesh. And what's interesting about that process of working where it's like you with the material is that as well as you kind of making the material with your hand through these different processes of kind of imparting energy into it, there's also a moment of take where your hands and almost like your body starts to take on, the different moments where it's like moments of, thinking about what I said earlier about little vandalisms, but also little scuffs, right? The hand starts to be an indexing of the process of working. And if you speak to anyone, a lot of us here work with our hands, right? When we're making, there is something about kind of the sacrifice of the body where you're indebted to, like, ultimately you want the piece to come forward. And in a way, your body's more or less, like, it gets in the way, and so you try to surpass it because all you're doing is trying to get the piece out. And in thinking about kind of the work as an index, this work is very much an index of process, an index of the different stages of making. And I started off wanting to crochet copper wire. I think that was like my starting point, where I had copper wire as like a starting point, and I wanted to transform it into something else, into, I guess, tapestry, right, into textile. And if you've worked with crocheting, if you've worked with wire, you realize that it doesn't necessarily want to be formed in that way. And so there's a lot of push and pull that has to happen, but eventually the material yields. And so then the piece itself, you can see moments where it's not particularly perfect, right? As I'm making a coil, there are moments of break. And that's what happens when you work with your hand, where it's not a smooth process, right? But I think you start to see the energies that you exert on the object through the object itself, which is why I call it like an index in the process of making. And so for me then, this process was like absolutely crucial to how I worked. And then this, in a way, trawl I consider as a sketch, but also as a prototype and also as a record. So all three things at the same time. And it as a way to kind of showcase how kind of the latencies that exist within a material can be unleashed through the hand, through the exertion of energy from the hand. And just right in front of me, I think I'm like, throughout as I've been speaking, I've been kind of mesmerized by the nightclub series by Carlos Reyes also, because it's what he's also kind of speaking about, where touch and breath are kind of ephemeral things that he's trying to capture through glass blowing, and through material. And I think that method of working is very important, right? Because the material is the tangible thing, but then you can use the material as a way to visualize and materialize intangible forms and intangible processes. And with that piece, with those sort of set of pieces, with glass in particular, glass as something that is malleable, right? But it's only malleable with the addition of heat. And in a way, if you just allow me for a second to kind of take a step back to the precursor of glass, which is sand, and it's like a material that I've worked with a lot. And one thing that's interesting about sand, and in a way it seems like a segue, but it's really not, because sand, we think of it as homogeneous, right? We think of, maybe perhaps not, it depends on what field you're in, but there is a certain like thought of homogeneity when you look at two samples of sand, but they're completely different. And they're different not just in terms of, say, like the silica content, but also the grains themselves, and the grains themselves as things that are records, right? Because with each grain, you can start to tell of the process of the action of wind, right? The process of wind flows, the process of water flows. And so that also then determines what it can be used for. So I think what I'm also trying to get at is that, like, with each material, there is a moment where it starts to record. And perhaps all materials do that, but we don't necessarily pay attention to it. So then back to sand, right? Each grain as a record of the activity of water, of the activity of wind, and then that determining what it can then be used for, right? Like, not all types of sand can be used to make glass, and then some end up in concrete. And as an architect, it's very much a conversation that comes up, but I think my interest in sand as a material is definitely not, I like to say, definitely not from thinking about, you know, the ubiquity of concrete and how conversations about embodied energy always come up. But I think with the material itself as this thing that's often overlooked. And to then kind of situate this method of working also in the epoch that we're in, when we think about sort of where we're going with almost a non-physical, like the non-physical world that we are tending to create for ourselves, I think it's important to then think about the ways in which we impart on the world around us through cycles of time, through cycles of change. And with that, it's sort of thinking about each moment your hand comes in contact with the material, right? It's not just a moment of, say, making, but there's a larger conversation there, which is why, in a way, for me, it's important to bring up like the sand conversation. Because when you think of glass, you don't necessarily think of its precursor. But each moment the hand comes in contact with the material, there is a larger conversation around the disparity between where we think about our material flows and energy sources and the final products that result, right? There's currently a kind of a larger dividing line between both things. We don't necessarily, when we have an object at hand, we don't necessarily think of where it's coming from. We don't necessarily think about how it's made. But when the hand and when the process of making is foregrounded, ultimately you're working with the material. And so you're thinking about how it's been sourced. You're thinking about how it got to your hand. And you're also thinking about the energies that you're putting into it to then transform it into a different material entirely. And so for me then with this piece Stroll, it was thinking about copper not just as an industrial material that has applications across kind of different things, across different fields, but it was a direct statement and a direct, almost like a labor of working with a direct statement on labor, right? Because me working with the material was very much me using my body, using my sort of physical power to transform and modify the material. So it's a direct conversation around labor, but in relation to the social and I guess political networks of flow of circulation that each material has within it and each material is engaged in. And so what I'm sort of trying to make sure that as we leave this room is to say that when confronted with whether to make or not to make, I think always go for choosing to make, right? Because when you choose to make, you're then, it is an act of care also for the material. It's an act of care that then means that you're thinking about the material as a node within these cycles of circulation, within these networks of circulation that I'm speaking about. And then your sleight of human touch, your sleight of hand, to then go back to the original phrase, is then very much present in these networks of circulation and these networks of flow. Thank you.